The ballroom shimmered like a jewel box, its chandeliers scattering golden light across velvet drapes and marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Musicians tuned their violins while laughter rippled through the sea of gowns and tuxedos. This was the Billionaire's annual charity ball, a gathering that was less about generosity and more about spectacle. Waiters carried silver trays laden with champagne, and in the background, servants in neat uniforms moved silently, refilling glasses and clearing plates, invisible to the glittering elite. Among them was Elena, a young maid balancing a tray with practiced grace, her dark hair pinned back, her eyes lowered so as not to meet the stares of the guests who barely noticed her. At the center of it all stood Mr. Harrow, the billionaire himself, a man whose booming laughter carried across the hall like a cannon blast. He thrived on being the entertainer, the ruler of this world of wealth, his ego feeding on the awe of those around him. Tonight, however, he sought something more, a performance that would etch the evening into the city's memory. Raising his glass, he commanded the room's attention. The orchestra hushed, the crowd silenced, and 1,000 eyes turned toward him. "My friends," Harrow declared, his grin wide and mischievous. "What is a ball without a bit of sport?" His gaze slid to his son, Adrian, a tall, impeccably dressed man standing stiffly at his father's side. "You know my boy here is a fine dancer. So let us make this evening interesting. Whoever dares to face him in a waltz, should they defeat him, shall win his hand in marriage." The room erupted in laughter. Fans fluttered, champagne glasses clinked, and whispers swirled like smoke. Some thought the billionaire was joking, others thought it a cruel kind of game. Adrian's jaw tightened, his polished smile faltering for a moment as he glanced at his father. He was used to being paraded around like a prize, but this public display gnawed at him. Still, he played the part, bowing with practiced charm as the guests cheered and teased one another about stepping forward. "Imagine," one jeweled woman whispered to her friend, "becoming Mrs. Harrow through a dance. More like surviving a humiliation," the other replied with a smirk. "No one here can match Adrian's training." As the laughter rose again, Elena passed by with her tray, hoping to disappear unnoticed. But fate rarely showed mercy. A drunken guest, eager for entertainment, pointed a jeweled finger toward her. "Why not her?" he shouted, his words slurring but loud enough to pierce the din. Heads turned. Elena froze, her cheeks burning as dozens of eyes fixed on her plain uniform and flushed face. Harrow's eyes lit up with cruel amusement. "Ah, the maid," he boomed. "Now that would be a show worth watching. What say you, girl? Do you dare waltz with my son?" A ripple of mocking laughter spread across the crowd. Adrian looked horrified, not at the thought of losing, but at the insult of being paired with a servant. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to shrink into the floor, to vanish into the shadows where she belonged. Yet something inside her stirred, an old fire, long buried under years of servitude. She had once lived for music, for dance, before life's misfortunes chained her to trays and mop buckets. She stammered, gripping the tray so tightly her knuckles whitened. The mocking eyes, the laughter, the smirks, they pressed against her like walls closing in. But then, through the blur of shame, she caught Adrian's dismissive glance, cold and superior. That look ignited the ember inside her. Lifting her chin, she took a deep breath. "I will dance," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. The laughter stopped. The silence was heavier than before, pierced only by the faint shuffle of the orchestra preparing. Harrow laughed again, clapping his hands with glee. "Marvelous. Let the music begin." The musicians poised their bows. Elena set down her tray, her heart thundering as she stepped forward onto the polished floor. The silk gowns parted around her like waves, the guests watching with morbid fascination. Adrian extended his hand with a stiff smile, condescending but unwilling to refuse. Elena's fingers brushed his, and though her knees threatened to give way, her spirit refused. Somewhere deep inside, the champion she once was stirred awake. The first notes of the waltz swelled through the ballroom, and with them, Elena took her first step, not as a maid, but as a dancer reclaiming her place beneath the lights. The first sweep of the violins filled the air, silken and commanding, wrapping the ballroom in its spell. Adrian placed his hand firmly on Elena's waist, guiding her into the starting position. His grip was tight, not out of care but control, as if he could will her into submission through sheer force. His polished shoes gleamed, his tuxedo pressed to perfection, every inch of him screamed refinement. Elena, in her plain black uniform and apron, looked like a shadow standing beside him, until the music carried her forward. The crowd leaned in, eager for the spectacle. Most expected a clumsy shuffle, a servant embarrassing herself before the city's elite. Adrian smirked, already imagining the humiliating stumble she'd make within seconds. He moved with mechanical precision, his training obvious, each step clean and rehearsed. For a moment, it seemed as though the crowd would be right, that Elena was over her head. Her first step faltered, her nerves nearly collapsing her resolve. But then the melody wrapped around her like an old friend. Memories surfaced. Bright lights, polished floors, her body twirling in perfect time to music that once defined her life. She remembered the competitions, the way judges' eyes had followed her every move, the applause that had roared when she bowed. That part of her had been buried under years of servitude, but it hadn't died. It had only waited. Her posture straightened, her chin lifted. The second measure began, and with it, Elena's body slipped into rhythm. Her feet moved with precision, not forced or rehearsed, but natural, flowing as if the music were an extension of her. Adrian felt the shift immediately. His partner, who moments ago seemed timid, suddenly glided as though she had lived on dance floors her entire life. His smirk faltered, gasps rippled through the crowd. "She's good," one guest whispered, disbelief dripping from the words. "She's more than good," another murmured, eyes widening as Elena spun effortlessly under Adrian's arm, her skirt flaring despite being nothing more than a servant's uniform. The rhythm pulsed through her veins, every step a declaration that she was more than the role they had written for her. Adrian struggled to keep up, his polished technique suddenly stiff against her fluidity. He tried to lead with force, but Elena anticipated each move with grace, her body responding with confidence that unsettled him. "You're full of surprises," he muttered under his breath, irritation mixing with something he couldn't name. "I was dancing long before I was cleaning floors," Elena whispered back, her eyes flashing with defiance. The audience shifted, their laughter turning into murmurs of awe. Even the musicians seemed emboldened by her performance, their playing growing sharper, richer, as though inspired by the energy she radiated. Step by step, she took command of the dance floor, no longer the timid maid but the woman she had once been, the champion. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had expected victory to come easily, but now he felt the heat of competition rising in his chest. He tried to quicken his pace, to show her he could still dominate, but the more he pushed, the more obvious his faltering became. A stumble here, a delayed step there, small mistakes, but glaring against Elena's flawless flow. The crowd noticed. Cheers began to replace laughter. "Look at her spin," a guest exclaimed, clapping as Elena executed a turn so smooth it looked effortless. "She's outshining him." Harrow, at the edge of the floor, chuckled at first, thinking the spectacle amusing. But his laughter grew tighter, his amusement thinning as he saw his son's discomfort. His eyes narrowed on the maid, who twirled with a confidence that had no place in her station. Elena's heart pounded with adrenaline, each beat fueling her determination. She wasn't just dancing for herself anymore. She was dancing for every moment she had been overlooked, dismissed, mocked. She was dancing for every dream she had been forced to abandon. Every step was defiance, every spin a strike against the walls of the life that had confined her. By the time the music reached its midpoint, the balance of the performance had shifted entirely. Adrian was no longer the centerpiece, Elena was. The ballroom, filled with pearls and silk, had fallen silent except for the music and the rhythm of her steps. Even the guests who had sneered at her minutes before now leaned forward with admiration. As the violins soared, Adrian pulled her into a final sequence, determined to reclaim control, but Elena matched him with perfect precision, her gaze steady, unafraid. She glided through the flourish as though born for it, and for a fleeting moment, Adrian knew the truth. He was losing. The music swelled toward its crescendo, and Elena prepared herself for what would come next. This wasn't just a dance anymore, it was a battle of dignity, and she wasn't about to surrender. The crescendo of violins surged, carrying the dancers into the heart of the performance. Adrian's movements grew sharper, more desperate. His pride, long polished and never tested, began to crack under the weight of his maid partner's brilliance. Each step he took seemed just a fraction behind hers, his rhythm faltering as he tried to reclaim dominance. The audience, who once expected his effortless victory, now shifted their attention entirely to Elena. She wasn't just dancing, she was commanding. Elena's body flowed with ease, each motion instinctive, as though the music lived in her blood. Her eyes focused, her breath steady, she didn't glance at the audience or at Adrian's tightening jaw. This was her moment, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the joy of it. She remembered the girl she had been, spinning across stages, clutching trophies with trembling hands, her parents cheering from the front row. Those memories had been buried under bills, sickness, and the cruel necessity of survival. But here, under the chandeliers, they rose again, breathing life into her every move. Adrian misstepped, his polished shoe grazing against hers. He cursed under his breath, his composure slipping. The crowd noticed. A murmur swept through the hall, followed by quiet laughter. Not at Elena, at him. She's showing him up, someone whispered. Imagine, a maid outshining a hero, another replied, shaking their head in disbelief. Adrian's face flushed crimson. His father's eyes bore into him, a silent command to win at all costs. The pressure mounted like a storm pressing against his chest. He gripped Elena's hand harder, forcing her into a tighter spin, trying to show strength. But she absorbed his force, softened it, and spun with such elegance that the crowd gasped in admiration. It wasn't his power that dazzled them, it was her grace. Elena felt the shift in the air, the energy of the audience feeding her spirit. For so long, she had been invisible, dismissed as part of the background, a fixture of service. Now every gaze was fixed upon her, not with mockery but with awe. She spun again, her skirt flaring, her steps landing with precision that left Adrian struggling to keep pace. Who is she? A guest muttered aloud. She moves like a professional, another answered, almost reverently. Harrow's amusement was gone. His smile had hardened into a thin line, his fingers tightening around his glass. He had meant for this to be entertainment, a cruel joke to remind everyone of his power. Yet now the joke was slipping from his grasp. His son, his pride, was being dismantled by the very servant he had meant to humiliate. The orchestra swelled, and Adrian made a last-ditch attempt to dominate the dance. He tried to quicken the pace, dragging Elena into an aggressive sequence. But she matched him step for step, her movements fluid where his were stiff, her control unshaken where his faltered. Each attempt to overpower her only revealed his own weakness. Sweat beaded on his brow, his smile cracking as his frustration mounted. Elena, meanwhile, seemed to glow. The music carried her, every turn lighter than air, every movement infused with a quiet power. She wasn't dancing for his hand or his father's approval. She was dancing for herself, reclaiming the identity stolen from her by hardship. Every spin was a declaration, I am not invisible. The crowd erupted into applause mid-dance, clapping in rhythm as Elena executed a daring series of spins, flawless in execution. Adrian stumbled slightly, his balance shaken, and the applause only grew louder. For the first time, the ballroom wasn't celebrating the heroes, it was celebrating her. Adrian's fury flared. He leaned close, his words sharp through his clenched jaw. You'll regret this. Elena met his glare with calm fire. No, she whispered, her voice steady. This is who I am. The final sequence began, the orchestra driving toward the climax. Elena knew it was time. She let her body flow with the music, pulling every ounce of skill she had once honed into her performance. Her final turn was nothing short of breathtaking, her form perfect, her landing seamless. The crowd gasped, then roared with applause, the thunder of their clapping shaking the air. Adrian bowed stiffly, his face pale with humiliation. His chest heaved, his pride shattered. Standing beside him, Elena lifted her chin, sweat glistening at her temple, her heart pounding but steady. She had done it. Before hundreds of eyes, she had not only survived but triumphed. Harrow rose slowly from his seat, his expression unreadable. The room hushed, waiting for his reaction. Adrian stood rigid, desperate for approval, but the billionaire's gaze slid past his son to rest on the maid who had stolen the night. For the first time, Harrow looked at her not as a servant but as something else, an adversary, and perhaps, a force to be reckoned with. The music faded, the applause echoing long after. Elena knew this was the turning point. The night had shifted, and nothing in the Harrow mansion would ever be the same again. The applause thundered on, rolling through the ballroom like a storm that refused to die down. Guests clapped until their palms burned, some even rising to their feet, eyes fixed not on Adrian, who had wilted under the spotlight, but on the maid who had just stolen the night. Elena stood tall despite her plain uniform clinging to her with sweat, her breath quick but controlled. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Adrian forced a smile, his bow stiff, his face betraying the humiliation twisting inside him. He had trained for years under private tutors, boasting of his elegance, but tonight, in front of the city's elite, he had been undone by a woman who scrubbed floors. His pride burned hotter than the lights above, but worse than his failure was the silence that fell when the applause finally ebbed. Everyone was waiting for his father. Mr. Harrow rose slowly from his seat. The room stilled instantly, as though someone had snuffed out the air itself. His glass clinked against the marble table as he set it down, his smile sharp but brittle. He took a step forward, his booming voice echoing through the hall. "Well, well," he said, drawing out the words. "It seems my little jest has turned into a spectacle none of us shall forget. The maid," he sneered softly, his gaze cutting into Elena, "has outshone even my son." Whispers surged through the crowd. Some guests smirked at Adrian's expense, while others glanced at Elena with newfound respect. Harrow's words carried weight, but his tone held an edge that made the air tremble. "Of course," Harrow continued, raising his arms theatrically, "a man is only as good as his word. And I did say," he paused, savoring the suspense, "that whoever bested my son would have his hand in marriage." Adrian stiffened, his jaw tightening. The thought of binding himself to the maid before all these people horrified him. Elena, too, felt her stomach twist. Marriage was never her goal. She had danced for dignity, for the thrill of remembering who she was, not for a prize she didn't want. Gasps erupted, eyes darting between Elena and Adrian. A maid marrying into the Harrow fortune. It was unthinkable, scandalous, a fairy tale no one had expected to see play out. Harrow smirked, convinced that this twist would humiliate her more than her victory could redeem. But Elena did not cower. She stepped forward, her chin high, her voice clear. "I do not want his hand." The ballroom fell silent. It was as though every breath had been stolen from the air. Even the orchestra stilled, bows hovering midair. Adrian's relief was visible, but it was quickly replaced with confusion as the guests leaned in, hungry for her next words. "I danced not for a husband," Elena continued, her voice carrying strength, "but for myself. For every time I was told I was nothing more than a servant. Tonight, I remembered who I am, and I will not trade that freedom for chains disguised as gold." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd, followed quickly by applause. This time, the clapping wasn't tentative or mocking, it was fierce, unrestrained, admiration swelling like a tide. Some of the guests even cheered. Adrian flushed deeper, the rejection slicing at his pride. Harrow's smirk vanished, his face darkening as control slipped further from his grasp. He had tried to make her a joke, then a prize, and she had turned both into victories on her own terms. "You dare defy my offer?" Harrow thundered, his voice booming with disbelief. Elena met his gaze without flinching. "I dare to live by my own will." The room erupted again, guests whispering fiercely, some openly clapping despite Harrow's glower. The billionaire's authority had cracked in front of his own empire, and the maid he had mocked now stood untouchable, radiant with defiance. Adrian stormed off the floor, humiliated, unable to bear the weight of 100 eyes judging him. Harrow, left standing before his guests, forced a laugh, thin, brittle, the laugh of a man cornered. "A fine show indeed," he muttered, but it no longer carried the command it once had. Elena turned from the dance floor, her steps steady, her heart pounding with triumph. She could feel the stares burning into her back, but for once, they didn't weigh her down. They lifted her. The maid who had entered the night invisible now left it unforgettable. As she disappeared into the shadows of the grand hall, the orchestra resumed playing softly, almost reverently, as though honoring her exit. The whispers would spread beyond these walls, carried into every corner of the city. The story of the maid who defeated a Harrow, not just with her dance, but with her refusal to be claimed. And for Elena, The victory was not in applause or respect, but in the simple, undeniable truth: she had reclaimed herself.